there are very reasonable disputes about exactly when and where the first Thanksgiving actually took place. Not that it especially matters. The regular observance as a national holiday is easily traced not to the arrival of the Pilgrims, but actually to the Civil War era, when President Abraham Lincoln decided to ask for a national observance that would help to foster a sense of patriotism and an awareness of ourselves as Americans before we tore America itself apart. Most cultures, however, do have a spring and a fall holiday of some sort that reflects the agricultural seasons of planting and harvest. But in most nations, those spring and fall observations become religious holidays as well as national holidays. And in our case, Thanksgiving is all of those things. It's a harvest celebration, it's a religious celebration, and it's a national patriotic celebration. I've been reading the work of the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade since I was in grad school, though I've never had the faintest idea how you were supposed to pronounce his name. But it was in studying his work 40 years ago that my Old Testament professor helped us to understand how the Jewish observance of Passover was not simply a recitation of their origin, but was in fact an almost magical feast in which their history was actually being repeated in the telling of the story, that it is happening to them concurrently as they recounted that their father was a wandering Armenian, that they spent generations in slavery in Egypt, and then the things that are on the Passover table, the things that are on the plate are reminders of the hardships of their deliverance from bondage and their journey to the land that had been promised to them, a land flowing with milk and honey. The events described in a Passover celebration are not, however, historical. I mean, they're recited as if they are historical, but there was never a mass exodus from Egypt. There was not a sudden conquest of the land that these nomads eventually came to occupy, nor did either Moses or Charlton Heston, for that matter, actually divide the Red Sea or provide manna in the wilderness from heaven. But the story is told as if it were absolutely historical, and the story defines families as being Jewish, and it defines that the land that they live on was given to them by a divine decree, that God gave it to them the way you would get a Christmas present wrapped up with a bow. And it bound them by telling this story, and in this observance every spring, it binds them together as a family and as a nation, and it binds them to their land. It makes their shared faith, their religion, literally, part of their government and part of their real estate, which Thanksgiving does for us. The Jewish claimed that God had given them the promised land, a land that was actually occupied by another nation at the time, a nation that had walled cities, it had farms, agricultural practices. It has no more authority than if I showed up at your house tomorrow morning and told you to move out because God had given me your house. Oh, and leave the keys to the Cadillac. God gave me that too. But we tell these stories and reenact these myths through ceremony, through liturgy, through sacred meals, and at some very deep level, we start to believe that they're true. God gave Palestine to the Jews. God gave North America to British invaders. We shouldn't call them settlers. The land was settled. There were 50 million people living here. So it wasn't that the land wasn't settled. The land was settled. It was invaded by the Brits. Russians appear in our time to think that they've got some kind of mythic claim to a great deal of Eastern Europe. Just as jihadists believe that God has put them in charge of Islam, so that killing other flavors of Muslims is not a moral travesty for them. It is, in fact, the will of God. When the Jews attacked the Canaanites, it was the will of God. When European invaders attacked Native Americans, they were enacting the will of God. They didn't have to morally question even the fact that they chased the women down and raped them. That wasn't a moral issue because they were, in one way or another, acting out the will of God. Now, Thanksgiving is all of that for our nation, even when it is that unconsciously. In our elementary schools, we draw pictures of pilgrims and Indians sharing in a great harvest feast. But in our homes, we draw upon previous generations to eat foods that may go back 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 generations. Now, our traditions from family home to family home are undoubtedly different in many ways, but Valerie and I have very concrete expectations for our annual Thanksgiving feast, from which we dare not vary. I mean, if I had not made the sweet potato casserole, I probably wouldn't be able to stand here in front of you today. The way my family makes a particularly crusty dressing, the prominent placement of roasted chestnuts, and that casserole that is both addictive and possibly just as addictive and bad for you as heroin. None of these things are normal foods for any of us to eat throughout the year. I mean, we're not next week going to be eating sweet potato casserole and cashews. Chestnuts. But they cannot go missing from our observance of Thanksgiving, or the ritual isn't being done right. And the ritual is part of the definition of how we are family. It defines who we are. But as Eliade points out, the ritual is also a part of reinvesting ourselves in our own myths of origin. The myth about God having gone into the real estate business on the behalf of the Jews, giving them clear title to a parcel of land that already had people living on it. But the God connection, by being able to say it was God's idea, that somehow justifies anything that they did to the Canaanites. It so clearly baptized their national interest that their wars were really not pathological land theft. It really wasn't about enslavement and cruelty and capturing young girls to make them sex slaves. They were just doing what God told them to do. As we here in America were trying to sleep off our tryptophan-induced Thanksgiving feast and nap, people in Egypt were waking up to a deadly horror as more than 300 worshipers in a mosque were being murdered by other Muslims, by their neighbors. And here's one of the things I wish all Americans could finally get through their thick skulls. The majority of victims of Islamic terrorism are Muslims. The majority of victims of Islamic terrorism are not Westerners. The majority are other Muslims. Now, why would Islamic terrorists kill worshipers in a mosque at Friday prayer? Well, because they were, from the jihadist view, the wrong kind of Muslims. In this instance, it was not a case of Shia attacking Sunnis or Kurds attacking Shia. In this case, the victims belonged to the smallest of the divisions of Islam called Sufism or Sufis. Sufism is often described as being the mystical branch of Islam, but in spite of the visuals of whirling dervishes that we've all seen in films, this is the branch of Islam that if we in the West could choose, we wish there were more of these, fewer of the radical Sunni and Shia sects, and a lot more of the Sufis. Its adherents are peace-loving, and their spirituality is rooted in meditation and contemplation. If there is a progressive branch of Islam, it is probably Sufis. But the existence of a peaceful and contemplative group of Muslims who, like other Muslims, pray 5 times a day, they memorize the Quran, they eat only halal foods. They just disagree with both Sunni and Shia on how to interpret the Quran. And Sunni and Shia folks would tell you there is no interpreting the Quran. The Quran is what it is. They all deny that they are interpreting it at all. They just tell themselves that the Sufis are heretics. In much the same way that Judge Roy Moore belonged to a religion that literally taught that you should get a wife as young as you could in order to raise them up to be obedient to the male head of the household. So you tell Roy Moore you cannot go to the mall and to high school football games and try to date teenagers, and he's just completely baffled. When he insists on his innocence, it's not that he didn't date teenagers, it's that he genuinely believes that the pedophilia that he practiced was ordained by God. Please don't get tired of listening to me quote Voltaire saying that anyone who can get you to believe in absurdities can persuade you to commit atrocities. That's the whole point of indoctrination. Religious, political, or ideological indoctrination is to get you to believe something that is absolutely insane. But if you confess that you believe it, then getting you to do things that are equally insane is just not that difficult. So Passover, Thanksgiving, Ramadan, these sorts of rituals that mix myth with history and national identity can be so powerful that we start to deny facts and gloss over either current events or more ancient violence. ISIS fighters killed 300 Sufis in Cairo on Friday. And you know immediately that that is disgusting. That is horrible. That is heart-wrenching. No myth of religious righteousness could justify that murder. But before we move on, let me just ask you, you know that fort right up I-44, Fort Leonard Wood? Do you know who Leonard Wood was? Do you know anything about Leonard Wood? Anybody know what Leonard Wood is famous for? Yeah, Newt.
He was a physician during the Spanish-American War and did law work and yellow fever and stuff like that.
Do you know about his leading an invasion in the Philippines?
Well, yeah, he was badass on that too.
Fighting diseases is one thing, but he was a general who in the early 20th century led our American armies in the invasion of the Philippines, and the battle for which he was the best known I didn't know about until I read about it in one of Mark Twain's collections of speeches. Mark Twain derided it at the time. But General Wood was engaging a group of Filipino insurgents who happened to be Muslims. And the Philippines was early on in adopting the Islamic religion among the indigenous, and these were called the Moro. Over 1,000 of these primitive indigenous ran into an inactive volcano crater to hide from the armies. All they had were wooden clubs and spears. So General Wood led his forces to the lip of the crater, set up machine guns, and they shot down and killed over 1,000 men, women, and children that had nowhere to run. They were completely captured. Then our servicemen went down into the crater and had their pictures taken sitting on mounds of dead bodies. Then we named this fort in Missouri after him as a great war hero. Now, in 1906, Wood's men killed about 1,100 defenseless Muslims. We still have a huge fort named in his honor. In 2017, a band of ISIS fighters killed 230 defenseless Muslims as they were gathered in a mosque for prayer. Now, to hear our media pundits talk about it, the immorality and vicious nature of ISIS is beyond comprehension. And I don't disagree with them. It is beyond comprehension. I just can't understand why my peers are so damn comfortable with keeping an honorific name for a war criminal who killed more people than ISIS. Why? Why do we get comfortable when we do it and think it's terrible when they do it? There are not many bleeding heart liberals who have not at one time or another quoted Gandhi's famous teaching that we must be the change that we want to see in the world. But in this case, the shoe fits. We want ISIS to stop murdering people. We want them to stop being proud of beheadings and assassinations. We want them to join the world of decent folks. But ladies and gentlemen, don't we have to go first? Don't we have to do the same thing? Telling the hard truth is what churches are supposed to be for. And I know an awful lot of them have given up into simply indoctrinating folks into our cultural myths so deeply that we can confidently say that the German genocide of the Jews is the worst event of modern history and totally ignore the fact that the American genocide of 40 million Native Americans the preceding century is somehow historically irrelevant and incredibly unavoidable. That is why, in my opinion, it's important for us to publicly pull these myths apart and take a serious look at what they're actually made of. We use national myths to build patriotism and to bind a diverse society together, but we can also use them to whitewash our history and our current conduct. From across the distance of a half a century, we can decry the racist ways in which black people were treated during the civil rights marches of the 1960s in America's South. But folks, this time last year, when the temperatures had dipped down into the teens in North Dakota, the sheriff's department outside of Standing Rock trapped over 200 peaceful protesters on a bridge, sprayed them down with fire hoses, and kept them there freezing with attack dogs and pepper spray to keep them from leaving the bridge where they were trapped. That was just last year. Made me buy a clerical collar to wear up there when I went to the protest. I was all about supporting our Native American brothers and sisters in their protest, but I sure didn't want to be pepper sprayed or frozen to death. I'm a little old for that kind of thing. But what I find remarkable is the way the media tried to suppress the civil rights marches in the 1960s, and we've all read books and textbooks about how horrible it was that the media ignored that, but then the media ignored it when we did it in 2016. What have we learned? Oh, and if you're keeping score, I did tell you last year that if Trump approved the completion of the DAPL pipeline, that it would leak. This week, 250,000 gallons of crude oil dumped on North Dakota. Now, I'm not a prophet. I know it sounds like I'm a prophet, but you don't have to be a prophet to predict that pipelines are going to leak. You know why? Because they all leak. There's never been one built that didn't leak. They all leak. The myth of American exceptionalism can find its origin rooted in the Thanksgiving story of harmonious celebrations between British invaders and Native Americans. And we know the truth of that relationship, even though, there were moments in which people got along. Even Ben Franklin comments in his diary that there were an awful lot of white folks that went and joined the native tribes because their way of living seemed to be much more attractive than the class-tiered societies of the American colonies. But by and large, our history with Native Americans has involved a tremendous amount of violence, broken treaties, land theft, and so often done in the name of God. We literally took Indian children off of reservations and put them into Christian boarding schools to keep them from learning their native language or their native religions and to turn them into brown versions of us. And we virtually enslaved them. We talk a lot about African slavery, but there were between 2 and 5 million Native Americans that were either enslaved on this continent or shipped abroad as slaves. Now, mostly what we captured and took abroad were women and children. That's for really bad reasons. The encounters between European and Americans sent corn and potatoes and pumpkins to Europe. You think about what was on the Thanksgiving table that the Pilgrims laid out in our coloring book versions of Thanksgiving. Turkey, pumpkins, corn, potatoes, All that came from the Indians. The Pilgrims didn't have that. Those are all North American crops. What the Indians got from us was cows, pigs, chickens, and wheat. We also gave them smallpox and measles and malaria. But because we captured millions of Native American women and children to take as sex slaves to Europe, they also got venereal diseases in Europe. I'd say they had it coming. But there were instances as well. I mean, this is not all about good guys and bad guys. There were instances of intertribal slavery. Native American nations would take neighboring nation Indians as slaves. Just like in Africa, among native tribes, there was slavery that was practiced. And then when they realized that the Europeans would pay for slaves, Indians were guilty of capturing their neighbors and selling them to slave traders. That happened in Africa as well. Humans of all stripes have a remarkable penchant for being simultaneously absolutely horribly cruel to one another while they tell themselves that God is blessing their activity. I want to say this very clearly. God doesn't want your damn genocides. God doesn't want your real estate. God doesn't want your slaves, and God sure doesn't want your self-righteousness. We don't need to expose the deception behind popular myths as simply a public shaming of white European history or some kind of religious self-flagellation, but only this: ignorance of history dooms us to repeat it. Self-deception about past failures means that you have learned nothing from those failures and you are setting yourselves up to do it again. Amen. Our faith journey should give us insights into ourselves and into our world, not serve as a set of blinders that keep us from ever knowing what's going on. When we're honest about it, we have to acknowledge that our path to this juncture in history involved the genocide of 50 million Native Americans, the enslavement of 12 million Africans, and the exploitation of uncounted legions of immigrants and some pretty shoddy treatment of the continent itself that we stole from its rightful owners. But the past doesn't have to be prelude, does it? We are in charge of our future, aren't we? And we can put some liberty and justice into our future. That liberty and justice that we want to say our nation is known for. We can put equal rights in it. We can put sustainable building and renewable energy into it. And please, let's put some sanity into our religion. God knows we've had enough of the other kind. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.